bless you. We see the Spirit of God within you, guiding, protecting, and prospering you always. Always, always, always. Great. Now, a little bit different this morning. I'm going to sit down to do my message because I don't have an affirmation, I'm tired, but my affirmation is I need to relax. I need to renew my energy, and so I'm going to sit while I deliver my message because it's easier. I think it'll be easier, I'm not sure. So our little humor this morning is, let me get over here, get organized. How's that? Okay. So little Susie was watching her father write his sermon, and she says, how do you know what to say? He says, because the Lord tells me. She says, well, then why do you keep crossing things out? Right. I arm wrestle with God with my sermons all the time. I think, I don't know that I want to say that. So, moving along in the Easter series, where we're moving toward resurrection for our lives, or resurrection into living more fully the truth of who we are, I'll probably use my hands a lot more since I'm not walking around. Reframing the cross, surrendering the ego. You know, there aren't any crosses in the Unity churches, even though there's a big idea of the cross as transformation. So I thought we'd talk about that today, so you can have a clearer understanding of how Unity feels about the idea of the cross. You know, the Cliff Note versions is it's crossing out the little self so that the greater self can lead your life and move in and through you. It's one of my friends used to say, sometimes I get the little me out in front of the big I, but the little me in you listens to the big I and kind of eliminates anything that blocks your life from being full and wonderful. That's it. We could go home now. We've reframed the cross. So, have you ever said to yourself, I'm not that person anymore? Raise your hand. I'm not the way I used to be. I used to be like that, but I'm just not that way anymore. How many of you have had that experience? Right, growing up when you were little, like I think of my little grandniece who just turned 3 last week. She is so defiant. If you say, sit down, she'll stand up like this. You know, she's not going to sit. She's just not going to do anything that isn't her idea. And so I was writing this lesson. I was thinking about some of the secretaries in our current administration in government, you know, and I thought they're wielding power without understanding the power that they hold. I remember one time when I was selling real estate, I listed the house of this minister and his wife. And his wife had always just been a stay-at-home wife. I don't know if she was a mother, but she'd never really had a career. But she decided she was going to become a real estate agent, and she was taking all the real estate classes. And I listed their home for sale, and it was beautiful. It sold in one day. And so I was back with an offer, and I come over to meet with them, and there she is with her tablet full of questions to ask the expert questions. She's going to demonstrate how much she knows about real estate. And so we go through the offer, and she stops, and she looks at the contract language, and she tries to ask questions. And I was just very patient with her, because if it's one thing I knew in selling real estate, it was contract law. I was the broker in an office with 38 agents, and I had to review every one of the contracts that they wrote. And I knew every phrase and every sentence, every phrase in our contracts, and I understood contract law. So she's positioning herself to be more than she's ever been before. And so we went through the offer. I answered all of her questions, and she kind of sat back at the end of that, and we got the house, the offer accepted, got the house sold. And on the way out, her husband, the minister, walked me out, and he said, she's wielding power, Cherie. She's never felt that she had any, and she's wielding power. And it was a good learning moment for me, because I look at Kristi Noem and people like that on the news, and they're wielding power. They don't understand the mantle of the power that they're carrying, and they're wielding it recklessly sometimes, inappropriately, certainly not with mindfulness. So this idea of the cross is reframing the cross is taking a look at your own life. Where are you wielding power or defiant or resentful, or what ego part of you is leading in your life that is maybe ready to be crossed out? We're going to look at that. So when you hear the words, take up your cross and follow me, a lot of people will immediately think of suffering, burdens, trials, hardships, all of that. But the deeper, more mystical meaning hidden in this teaching is the cross is not merely a symbol of pain, crucifying pain. It's a symbol of transformation. It's a symbol of transformation. That's Unity's main teaching. The cross represents the sacred meeting place between heaven and earth as a symbol and human life, which is the spread of your life. The vertical beam represents divine truth, the eternal reality of who we are in God, and the horizontal beam represents the human experience, the reality of who we are in God. Can you see that against that green? That's kind of hard to read, isn't it? The vertical beam is the divine truth of us, and the horizontal is the eternal reality of God. And the next slide shows that the physical part of us, the human self of us, this is our life. Our relationships, our ambitions, our fears, our wounds, our desires, everything out here in our physical matter world. So when these two beams meet, that's where the real work of the soul begins. So it's the divine of you and the human self of you meets typically in the heart. The cross isn't something outside of us, it's something within us. So if you visualize a little golden light in your heart, that's a cross. And take up the cross then means to allow the human self of you, the ego in you, to be transformed by divine truth. In that moment when I walked out with that minister and he said, she's wielding power, Cherie, there was a realization that dropped into me, an understanding of the mantle that we carry in power. And it dropped into my heart, and I've understood that. You can get in situations when you're the leader of the ministry or whatever, and you have to step back sometimes. In a marriage, you have to step back and allow the other person to shine. The ego in us isn't evil. I always shudder that the Course in Miracles has tried to throw out the ego completely. The ego simply believes that it has to control everything. That's the self of us that thinks, I'm in charge of my life. I got here, I'm physical, I'm living in the world, I'm in charge of my life. And the ego says, I have to win, I have to be right, I have to be recognized, I have to protect myself, I have to stay safe, I have to get my way. That's that urging thing that sometimes uses wisdom and sometimes doesn't use wisdom. The ego in us is what builds our identities, our defenses. It's the stories of who we are and about who we believe other people are. But the spiritual truth, that path inevitably brings us to moments where those identities can't survive any longer. That's why I said, have you ever said, I'm not that way anymore? Think about, I can think back on times of childhood when I was afraid to speak up. I was never a shy child. That was never me. But there were times I was afraid to speak up and say my feelings. And I've had to really take counseling, go to, do spiritual study to understand how to say my feelings and how to say them without harming others, without wielding spewing my feelings in a reckless way. So we think back on those parts of us that cannot survive and continue to be happy or to live in peace or to live in joy. And there are moments, those are moments when we're invited to surrender. Let's see, don't I have another slide up there, Jack? A couple of them we've missed. Next, where the two meet is where the real soul work happens. And next, take up your cross means to allow your human self, your ego, to be transformed by divine truth. And it's the inevitability that the ego self of you can't survive and be happy. At some point, there'll come a level of frustration and anxiety or despair that you just think, I can't go on living this way. I can't be this way anymore. And the ego resists surrender. It resists surrender because the ego believes that surrender means death. means death to the ego self. And in a way it does, but what dies is not you. What dies is the illusion that you're the one in charge of everything. This is why crucifixion is not primarily about punishment. It's about transcendence. Now that I know better, I do better. Now that I've eliminated this part of me that was defiant or afraid to speak up or whatever, I can live more fully the truth of who I am. So, crucifixion represents a moment when the false self can no longer rule your soul. And that human self of you, you get intuitions and you just push them aside. You push them aside. I was sharing with the board, I'm fairly intuitive, but I don't always listen to my intuition. And when we listed the property for sale, this building for sale, my intuition said, talk to the people in the parking lot. And I thought, well, Huber's across the street, Huber Property Management. They own an enormous amount of buildings around in Lincoln and Roseville and Auburn and everywhere. I thought maybe they'll want to buy the building that's right here in the parking lot. But I didn't do that. And so then the voice kept saying, talk to the people in the parking lot. So one day I called across the street, across the parking lot to Huber, and I said, who's in charge? Who's the owner here? And they said, Ryan is the son. And so Ryan came over and he looked at the building and walked through everything. I said, you want to buy our building? And so we had a long talk and he made some suggestions that I couldn't work with. And then he kept calling to see if we were a fire sale. He said, well, do you have like a big balloon payment coming due or something, Cherie? No, the building's just for sale. So nothing ever came from Huber, and kind of they have a reputation of being a little bit shyster-like. So I wasn't anxious to go across into the parking lot and talk to them about buying our building. But the reality is our buyer owns the massage building next door. And I never went to that building. But my intuition was saying, talk to the people in the parking lot. But I didn't follow, I just thought, well, I thought Huber owned most of the stuff in the parking lot. So our buyer did come from the woman who owns the two buildings on the right-hand side of us, not the ones that own the building across from us. So that crossing out, that thinking you know it all, or finally followed what my intuition was saying and it didn't work out or it wasn't right, and then you move on. Sometimes those are signals to pull in more deeply, pull in deeper, like our song we sang, I'll go deeper and deeper, to really listen to what's happening. So letting go kind of always precedes a rising. There's no resurrection without surrender. So you surrender that idea. Letting go precedes rising. There's no resurrection without surrender. I was reminded of the story of Daniel, who attended a meditation retreat I attended at the same time once. And he came after his life had fallen completely apart. He'd built a very successful career. He was respected in his field. He was financially secure and admired by all of his peers. But he was controlling and demanding and constantly driven by, he said, his need to prove himself, by his need to be right. And so, as you can imagine, his relationships suffered. His marriage slowly eroded. How many of you have been married to the person that always has to be right? That's a difficult marriage to navigate. Anyway, his children grew distant, and eventually everything around him collapsed. So, my phone's talking in my ear right now, sorry. Anyway, his wife left him, his company forced him out, his reputation took a hit that he couldn't repair. And when he arrived at this meditation retreat, he was really angry. He just carried a deep sense of anger. And he blamed everyone around him, his co-workers, his family, the economy, even God. I don't know how he got to this spiritual retreat, but somebody must have said, you need to do something. You need to deal with that. So during one of the meditation sessions, the teacher asked the participants to reflect on the phrase, not my will, but divine will. Not my will, but divine will. In the Lord's Prayer, it's not my will, but thine be done, isn't it? So Daniel said he felt those words were offensive to him, that he'd spent his entire life building his will and shaping his destiny and controlling his circumstances and making his life work. And the idea of surrender felt like failure, just felt like failure. In unity, we sometimes say when we just let that be and just trust only God, sometimes we're criticized. It's called spiritual bypass, that you're just going to use some kind of spiritual phrase or affirmation to not really deal with what's happening in your life. But something kept Daniel returning to that phrase, not my will, but divine will. And so he let it turn over in him, when we have times of silence at a retreat, you go back to your room, or they send you on a nature walk and all that stuff. And so by the end of the weekend, for the first time, he said he sat down with that phrase and stopped defending himself internally. He stopped rehearsing arguments about what the coworkers had said and what the company had done and how his wife had left him and all of that stuff. And he stopped justifying his anger. I have a right to be upset about this that's happening in my life. And instead he asked himself a simple question. What if I'm not the center of this story? What if it's not all about me? So he later described that moment as his own inner crucifixion. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible, but something broke open in him that he had to realize that he wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one making it all happen. And he realized how much of his life had been driven by fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of not having enough, fear of trying to prove himself. And he realized how tightly he'd clung to his identity of being successful and powerful and admired and a big hit, great husband, great boss, great employer, great everything. And in that moment, when he took that affirmation inside himself, not my will, but divine will, he said, as he said it again and again, he said something in him softened. And years later, he said he looked back at his life and it was very different. And that, when I tell this part of the story, it's like, so your heart is softened and you're not the big shot anymore and your life is better. How is it better? Well, it's better because you're liberated and you're happy. He was excuse me, he was no longer the powerful executive that he once was, but he went to work for a nonprofit mentoring young entrepreneurs. His relationship with his children slowly was healed. And one day he said something that stayed with me after all those years we'd gone to that meditation retreat. He said, when I lost all of that, I thought my life was destroyed. But what actually died was the person I thought I had to be, not the person that I was. And that's the working of the cross. See, what the ego calls loss, the soul calls liberation. I think I feel many of us have parts of us that we'd like to improve on, and we slip into whatever, resentment, or we slip into negative thinking or something, and we wish we didn't do that as often. And each of us carries some kind of something we'd like to cross out. And that happens whenever the divine of us intersects with the human self of us. That's when we know it's time to let that light in our heart start to work to transform how we're showing up in the world. And those intuitions come when maybe we have to forgive someone who hurt us. That's the truth is there's only peace and love, and oops, I still feel bad about this, when that intersects. When we have to release control over an outcome, which your board and I have had to do for the last year in selling the building. We've had to just know the truth about a divine and perfect purpose for Unity of Auburn and let all of this who, what, when, where, how go. When the divine truth intersects with the human self of us, sometimes we have to admit that we were wrong about something, or we have to let go of an identity that no longer fits when we say, I'm not that way anymore, I'm not that way anymore. As a little girl, it was very hard for me to keep a secret, very hard for me to keep a secret. And I learned through trial and error that confidentiality is vitally important. You should rest assured as your minister, confidentiality is really important. And so I'm not that little girl anymore who just had a secret. It was like, it was so exciting to have a secret. But anyway, I'm not that way anymore. If you can think of times in your life that you can say that about your life, you're allowing the Spirit of God within you to transform you, to liberate you from things that aren't the best for you. These moments can feel like dying because something within us is dying. The false self is dying, the ego structure, the old story of how we used to be. But the soul knows something that the ego cannot see. On the other side of surrender, there is freedom. On the other side of crucifixion, there is a rising up into the greatness of who you are and whose you are. So you have to ask yourself this morning as you're hearing our lesson, is there a pattern in me? Is there a discomfort in me that I'm being asked to surrender right now? Is there something that keeps floating across my mind that I think, oh, I wish I didn't do that. I wish I didn't do as much of that as I do. I wish I didn't handle that the way I handle it. I wish I was kinder in my family. I wish I called my family more often. I wish I was more loving. I wish I had a more supportive word to my family members. Whatever it is there something in you this morning that you're being asked to surrender, to be more loving, to be more kind, to be more present to people? Maybe something in you says your need to always be right, or your need to control. What's that one say? When we surrender to God, it's never truly, what we surrender to God is never truly lost. It's transformed so resurrection can begin. So what is it that we might need to give up? The need to always be right. So a lot of people need that to protect themselves, to feel safe. Is it the need to control things? How many of you have worked around people that micromanage everything you want to do? That's kind of irritating, isn't it? The need for approval, or the need to hold on to some kind of resentment. Whatever it is, this morning we want to bring it gently into prayer and allow yourself to meditate on the words, not my will, but divine will. And you can say it slowly and let it move from your mind into your heart. And you may feel a little resistance, especially if it's about forgiving someone who hurt you, or giving up the need to be right, because that's a self-protection, that's a self-defense mechanism in you. But your ego will tremble when you know you're getting close to transformation, because your ego is going to tremble when your senses surrender. That's on the slide too. Next slide. Next slide. The invitation of the spiritual path is not self-destruction. Where is that? Well, anyway, the invitation of the spiritual path is not self-destruction, it's self-transformation. So when we ask this morning, what in me could use a facelift? What in me could use an uplift? What in me no longer serves that I can cross out of my life so that the little me doesn't get out in front of the big I, right? Every small surrender aligns the horizontal line of our human life, with the vertical line of our divine truth. And it's at this intersection that something sacred is born. Something sacred is born. So, this morning the invitation of the spiritual path is, as we says here, it's not self-destruction, it's self-transformation. And to take up the cross is to allow divine love to reshape us. You know, to be able to say, I'm not that way anymore. Oh, I used to be like that. And you see it in other people sometimes before you see it in yourself. When I look at my little grandniece who's so defiant, I think, was I ever like that? I don't know. I was kind of an obedient child. But, you know, we see it in other people. When we see somebody who's rude and offensive, you know, they say you point the finger at someone and 3 fingers are pointing back at you. Oh, I'm not like that. Yes, I am, right here, you know. So it's a signpost to say, is there something in me? If I can see it in others, I have it in me so that I can recognize it in you. And that's the time for me to do a self-scan and a check with what in my life is showing up that's not in alignment with the divine truth of me. To take up the cross is to reshape us. It's to release what we've thought we had to be, and it's to trust that the life waiting beyond this surrender is far greater than our need to try to control everything all the time. So, when the cross appears in your life, when you face a moment of surrender, You remember, it's not the end of the story, it's a doorway. It's a doorway to something greater in you being born, being resurrected into new life. Because the deepest truth of the soul is what we surrender to God is never truly lost. It's transformed. It's transformed. And from that transformation, then resurrection begins. Resurrection begins. So our affirmation this morning is, I surrender the false self and align with spirit. I am centered, I am free, I am guided. So think about that thing in you that you want to transform in this Easter season, resurrecting into new life. I always think it's marvelously a demonstration of spirit that are building a soul, that we're moving into new life for Unity of Auburn, culminating in the Easter resurrection story. The resurrecting Unity of Auburn into new life. And those of you that went over to the church yesterday could feel the energy of all the newness that's coming. So let's speak this affirmation in your life and for our church together. I surrender the false self and I align with spirit. I'm centered, I am free, I am guided. And then also in your bulletin this morning, in the Easter series, I've had a responsive reading. You have a little half sheet in your bulletin. Does anybody not have a copy? Raise your hand up as you're bulletin. Okay. So let's walk through this. I've been keeping these pages on my coffee table next to my prayer one, where I do my prayer, to read through it through the week, because I think they're very helpful. So I'll read the leader part, and you read the congregational part, all right? Where is the place of true strength? Isn't that a beautiful visualization of the cross and the heart, the intersection of spirit and life? What must I release to find balance? When the ego whispers, I must defend myself. When the mind struggles with worry or doubt, I am not my past. I am not my fears. The vertical beam of spirit flows through me. Isn't that a wonderful thing? The cross within is holy and unheavy. There is one presence and one power in my life, God the good, omnipotent. I surrender the false self and align with spirit. I am centered, I am free, I am guided. And so it is. Wonderful meditation. Mysticism on the planet, how we do it is for all the plants, we're in the hemisphere, we're all moving north hemisphere spring. Everything is moving up and out into the fullness of beauty. That includes your soul and all the parts of your life. Work with these readings and prayer time. So let's take that into an affirmation of time of prayer. I'll invite you to get comfortable in your seat and take a deep breath in. In the stillness of God's presence now, turn from any outer concerns. Give yourself this place of sanctuary, this moment of sanctuary. Become aware of God's infinite, loving presence now. Vertical line of light moves from the heavens into your heart. where this ego thing has been surrendered and loosened its grip. See your soul beginning to rise up and